started. Okay, go live. Okay, welcome back to Lisp NYC for December 2023. I'm your host, Arthur Smiles. I'm really glad you guys could join us tonight. I don't know about you guys, but I can't wait to get started. So with us tonight is Kent Pitman. He is he was the main chair of the Common Lisp Errors and Restarting Committee, which was part of the Common Lisp committee that created Common Lisp. He also created the Hyperspec, which I proudly lived in for the first 2 years of my Common Lisp experience, basically every single day. And, you know, he's been a lifelong Lisper. It's been around. And with that, I think I should just give it to Kent. So, hello, Kent.
Hey there. Okay. Let me just share my screen here. Sorry. We'll have
Share screen is the third icon on the bottom on your browser.
Yes. And we went through this yesterday, so hopefully it will go through more smoothly. I'm going to share my whole screen so that if I need to... oh, wow. That was that infinite thing you said.
Yeah.
I've never seen
So now we see convergence points
before. To use your microphone, I am going to say you can. It's not the right. Wow, this is so weird. Now I can't find my.
Yeah. Okay. You make your browser smaller.
Make my browser smaller.
Oh, when you shared the screen, you probably shared the. You did share screen, or did you just do share window?
Hold on a second. I have to just. What am I? Still select monitor to share. Built-in display. Share. Oh, now you're all seeing that. I see.
You just moved the 6 point to the middle.
Yes. So, does this happen to everyone? This is so...
Yeah, it usually starts at the beginning. But if you, what you could do is you can just do tab, new, just leave this open, and then you can load your presentation.
Oh, I see. Oh, I got it. Yeah.
There we go.
So, what I would like to do is to leave it in this mode, but I'm going to, against my better judgment, actually go into slideshow mode. So we'll see if we can have some issues there, except that now we're in the middle of the thing, so that's not exactly right either. All right, here we go. Slideshow, you would think that slideshow mode would start with the start. All right, welcome everybody. I apologize that this is a little bit hastily thrown together. I've had some personal issues that are occupying all of my time right now. So this will be a little bumbly, but I think I have a lot of things that I'd like to talk about. Sorry. Okay, so we're still in I'm going to stay in this mode. Does somebody complain if I cannot, if you cannot read this at this size? But I think this will be a lot easier for me for navigation. So yeah, I wanted to talk about, when I was asked to talk about Lisp, I wanted to talk about really what I had taken away from it. And there's quite a number of things that I think, I mean, I assume that most of the people, if anybody's bothering to attend.
We're back to the infinite hall of mirrors.
Oh, you're seeing that. You're not seeing my screen. Because I switched windows. And for some reason, you're not seeing that.
Yeah. Oh, wait.
All right, let me...
Wait. You know what? It might be...
stop share and start again.
What I think it is somebody else shared their screen and stole focus automatically. So Kent's screen was fine, but it looks like Steve is sharing as well.
Yeah, just click the share screen again.
Okay, I have done stop share, and I'm going to start. Maybe it will steal it back.
Yep.
All right, so... is it asking me? Oh, it's asking me here. Entire screen, built-in display, share. Tell me when you can see my screen.
Let's see.
Is it still querying me? Because I don't see where it's querying me.
Yeah. Yeah, click stop and start again.
I apologize to everybody for this. We did actually practice this before. All right. So I'm telling it to share screen, and I'm seeing nothing here. I'm going to exit and then.
Okay, we'll wait for Kent to get back. In the meantime,
I'm in.
Okay, here it is.
And it's asking me again about all these things that it wants me to do. Go to display. Share. All right. Well. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, now we can see it again. Okay, great.
All right. Well, welcome back for the second or third try here. I assume if anybody's bothering to attend this talk that they're already familiar with Lisp, or else I don't know why they would want to hear me speak. And so what I wanted to do was kind of take you through some things that you might not know about Lisp's design in general. And also I wanted to just also start off by just even talking about like my personal road to Lisp, because I don't think that's documented anywhere, and there are some sites that have things like that. So I'm going to begin with that just to sort of put you a little bit into sort of my context and where I'm coming from. I started from a blank slate, and by that. I mean, we didn't have computers when I was in high school. This is what passed for computation. I don't know if anybody, there are probably a number of people here who've never seen a slide rule, but this is in fact how you did computation when I was in physics class, for example, in high school. Is you want to multiply, for example, 2 times 3, you would go and find 2, that's the 2 there. And then now you want to go down here and find 3 and read up and see that the answer is 6. So we moved sticks around and that got us answers. It was a strange world where I lived, where I was in the Panama Canal Zone. This is my house here, right here on the mouth of the canal. This is the Panama Canal, and this is Panama City, and this is my house. So it's a nice place to be. But they had a rule against having computers. There was only one computer, it was an IBM mainframe, and they wanted to centralize all of the computation. It was an American government installation, so everything had to be done through that one computer. And my high school did not have computers, and so we had to. There was one Fortran course that somebody eventually made, and the way that worked was that we wrote on paper the programs that we wanted, and they were sent across town, where somebody who had access to a punch card machine would punch in the instructions to be done, and then that would be sent across town to the place where the computer was, and then they would run that after hours because the computer liked to sleep after 5. And then we would get back an answer probably the next day, maybe 2 days out. And it would probably say something like syntax error because somewhere along the way there would be some problem. So it was pretty low tech. And a friend of mine had parents that were high up in the school system, and they managed to get us a real computer. It was a basic mini computer with 8K of memory. And we spent the summer, he and I, testing out that computer for them to make sure that it was going to work okay for the school. And we didn't really have any instruction on how to do that beyond the one course we had in Fortran. And so the first thing that was odd to me was just that it said it was basic, and I didn't really understand the difference between basic and Fortran. It all just seemed like kind of computerish stuff. It was almost like it was a different dialect of Fortran or something, for all I knew. But when I say we started with a blank slate, it was really quite blank. We would see things that were written in books that were output from programs, and we would say, oh, maybe we can write a program that does something like that. And so one of the programs that we saw some output from was something called, it was a guess an animal program. And the way the program was supposed to work was it was supposed to ask you, like, is your animal a dog? And you would say no. And it would say, what animal were you thinking of? And you would say cat. And then it would say, well, what yes, no question distinguishes a cat from a dog? And you would say something like, does it have claws? And then it would say, does it, yes implies which answer, no implies which answer. It was very pedantic, but it was interesting because, like, we really just didn't know what computers could do, and here was some output from a computer. So I went and I sat at the console and I tried to figure out how to write a basic program that could do that. And the first thing that I hit was the dimension statement for allocating an array for my animals, and I didn't know how many to make. And it was a real puzzle for a while until I noticed that there was a tape drive next to the computer. It's just an audio cassette tape kind of thing, but it was capable of storing some amount of data. And so I figured that I could make a thing that I didn't quite know what I was making, but it was a pointer structure that had the question, and then it pointed it down to a record farther down the tape if it was a yes answer, and even farther down if it was a no answer, and it would just kind of follow. It turned out that basically I invented like cons structure, and also it was persistent, which was something I didn't really appreciate until later as a thing. But I was fascinated when I got to MIT, and they had it already. Like when my first course was with Joe Weizenbaum, who was the author of the ELISA program. He taught the Intro to Lisp course at MIT, and there it was. It was like the list structure was just like the thing that I had made for my animal program. So I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. This language is for me. So that's sort of how I came to to Lisp. I also liked the fact that there weren't commas all over the place in enumerating the things. So when you wrote down your little sentences,
If you don't mind, Kent,
yeah.
Could you press the on your for the Jitsi window? Can you press the camera unmute so we can see you on the side?
There... Oh,
yeah. So just go back to that and then click the camera icon. It's on the bottom of the.
oh,
yeah.
I see.
Oh, yeah. You got it. You got it. We can see you now. We got you.
Oh, okay.
Great. Excellent.
So now you've got both.
Yep, we got both. Awesome.
Also, other people can interrupt me if you have any questions along the way.
Well, I'll just make a quick comment that I'm really glad you started from the beginning, because this was actually one of my first questions I wanted to ask you is, how did you start getting into computers? Right? Because we all have that story, and I just love. I'm really enjoying listening to it.
So the Canal Zone was a really fascinating place, but it was very, very isolated, and so it was. I think the reason why I'm telling this story, in part, just because the Road to Lisp story.
By the way, the unmute the camera didn't work. I only see a KP, not the actual U.
Actually, no. You could see it in the bottom right corner. If you see the shared screen, you could see Kent.
Should be down around here somewhere.
Yeah, in the bottom right hand corner of the shared screen.
Okay, now it appeared.
Okay.
Yeah. It seems to lag a little on this somehow, in addition to all the other problems. But that's fine. So
what kind of computer was your high school computer?
I have an essay which I will sometime publish about my ambivalence about the whole notion of building lots of libraries in programming languages, because they codify things, but they also stop people from thinking about certain kinds of things. Like, people don't like to make a library. Once you start to work on something for which there's already a library, now everybody just says something like, there's a library for that. And then you never get to do anything anymore. You just need to pull in a bunch of libraries. And I think computation was a lot more fun back in the days where there was just literally nothing written and everything you wrote was new. So, and I think that infects somehow the way I think about things. And I don't know. I mean, part of this, I think, is intended to help you maybe just think about a few things differently than you thought about them before, and to start to question, like, should you maybe think about other things differently than you thought about before? I think we're all so caught up in the notion of efficiency about things that we don't. It's almost like in the ancient Egypt days or something, when there were all these different gods you prayed to, and that each one cared about a certain thing. That efficiency is an important thing, but there's like robustness and sustainability and just a lot of other kinds of things, like environmental friendliness and things that you can make money at, and there's a lot of things you could care about. And redundancy is not necessarily a bad thing. Thinking things through again, somehow we've made a world in which we try to squeeze all of that out, and I think along with it a lot of the fun. So this was a fun time for me, and it's something to think about how to keep that in the community. I also worked in community theater. That was a big thing here, and I include that because you never quite know what's going to turn out to be important, and that's the reason there's a lot of, like, cultural diversity is a thing which has become more important, and I'm really glad for that. But sometimes it just seems like it's like an optional added extra. And I want to say how essential really things like that are, to have people coming in with a variety of different skills and backgrounds and stuff. Because when the standards work happened, theater was a lot of what I drew on, and not just the presentation, like the acting part, because I didn't do a whole lot of that, but I did watch a lot of people sit around at the end of the evening talking about this is how I feel in this scene. How do you feel in this scene? And I got a kind of a three-dimensional view of a scene where, you would put yourself in each person's shoes and say, how would it feel to be that person? And when it comes to doing some of the standards work that we'll get to later, this business of being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes is important, because sometimes you see the way people behave in some other place or at some other organization or at some other time, and you think like, wow, that's so strange. But if you think sometimes, if that were me and I lived in that situation, how would I behave? Sometimes it's not as strange. Like sometimes it's that you're just not putting in the energy to think about how somebody survives in some circumstance other than your own, and what their needs might be in that different circumstance. So my theater training helped me a lot with that. And so I just wanted to throw in a plug for liberal arts, because that kind of thing comes up a lot in things that I do. I want to talk about what I liked about Lisp, and this is sort of initially I'm just talking about like things that were already there, because I'm not really responsible for Lisp existing, obviously. In fact, I'm just about as old as Lisp is, to within a few days. And so obviously I did not get involved in it when I was 0 years old. So some amount of work was done well before the time when I came along. One of the things I like about it is how expressive it is. And I want to talk a little bit about expressiveness, because I think it's something that people talk about and don't actually like get into the serious weeds of what exactly that means. I saw a talk by somebody from a company called Bitstream, which used to make fonts. I don't know, they might or might not still do that, but they were originally one of the early font foundry companies. And they talked about how they designed fonts. And I found it interesting because I had just designed my own font. And I designed it by going into a pixel editor and saying, this is what each pixel in this letter should look like. This is what each pixel in this should look like. And then I wrote some stuff and it looked good and I was happy with it. But this guy who was giving the talk, and they were talking real fonts that had much more, many more DPI than what I had designed. What he said was, we don't design characters. We think about how those characters will work in words, and we're more concerned with how to design words. And I thought later on that was really the right way to understand programming languages. So it's true that we obsess a lot. We go to individual pages. I spent a lot of time. I spent several years working on as project editor for ANSI Common Lisp, for example, just writing the individual entries, or rewriting mostly, since there were already drafts for them when I took it over. The individual entries and getting the descriptions as good as I could. We focus on, this is what this operator does, this is what its semantics are, this is what its arguments are, and so on. But what makes those decisions good is not that you made an especially good aref function, or an especially good fun call, or whatever the thing is. The question is, what do they look like when they're composed? And so it's really the composition of things that's important, because, for example, you'll notice in some languages that like, for example, arrays are 0 indexed in some languages and they're 1 indexed in other languages. And you might think, oh, those are good or bad choices. But what makes those good choices is, do the other operators expect that, or do you have to subtract 1? If the array reference operator is expecting a 1 indexed value, then that's not always bad, but you have to know that you're going to do things differently. If the trigonometric functions have different branch cuts, that can work, but it has to be pervasive throughout the whole language. It can't be that one one operator disagrees with another operator about how they're going to take arguments or return values. It has to be something where when you compose it, it feels good. So, so that's part of the expressiveness thing, is it just has to let you write things that work together well.
I have a question concerning that. But first, I just want to just share some comments on the chat. Richard Kryler says here. So I guess he was agreeing with what you were saying before. And someone mentioned about, I guess Bitstream is from Bitstream Verifame. I guess that was like a font company, right? Bitstream, when you mentioned that earlier.
Bitstream is a font company, yes.
And as far as my question, so what you were talking about how with arrays, depending on like, and maybe this is getting a little ahead, but about like 0 or 1 based, and how when you have a language, you want the language to be consistent, right? That the operators are consistent. Now, with Common Lisp, when you guys were putting Lisp together, you had these various, you were trying to standardize what was going on in the community because there was a fracture. So how did you guys go about like when you created Common Lisp to kind of follow that methodology?
Well, I'll say something here that's probably not in my slides, and I wish it was. I kept like trying to add slides today, and I just kind of ran out of time and stuff. And then I have some other stuff on that will come up later in the slides. But I mean, partly there's a certain amount of design that is done usually by 1 or 2 people. Like standards, which I have a slide about, are not really the same as design. And so you don't want to come into a standards group thinking you're going to do design. It will not work very well. The democratic process is not a way to do the main backbone of the design. And so that part of the design was mostly already done by people who thought more carefully and were working in sort of a more close group. It usually works best in a standards group if you come in with a reference document, or you might have 2 or 3 and you might have to fight over whose is going to be the reference document. But it's good to have something which is basically in order. You think about the US Constitution, for example, like Tom Jefferson or somebody came in with, the Constitution mostly written. I don't know the exact history of that, but I can tell you for sure that they did not come in to the group where all the representatives were there in Congress and say, how should we make the first sentence? Let's take a vote. That would not have worked. I don't think it would have converged. So some of these things are sort of things that you bring in, and the place where a standard happens is where you've had success with somebody having done sort of an isolated thing, and now a bunch of people are using it, or there's 2 competing things and it has to be resolved or something. And that's sort of where standards come in. But usually that other stuff is, somebody gets an idea and they just work it through in their mind, or they worked through with a friend of theirs or something like that. And in the case of Common Lisp, there was a thing called the Gang of 5. I think that was Steele and Macinter and Fallman, and I'm not sure who else, but they're probably on the cover of the original CLTL book. Macinter might know. I noticed he was here. But in any case, they had a theory of what it is that they were going to put together, and then we voted on details, and we proposed details. I proposed a lot of details. I remember at some point somebody actually asking, how come we're doing so many of Pitman's things? And it was just because I wrote them up. I mean, like, I think there were like 900 little small proposals, and I wrote several hundred of them. I think I don't know, maybe I'm misremembering, but it was a lot, and it was disproportionate, but it was just that other people didn't. And I had sat with Maxima, which was a large symbolic algebra system, and I had tried to port it from one system to another. I took extensive notes on every single porting problem that I had. And I thought, well, I'm just going to make an issue out of every single one of those, and we're going to try and make the system more portable by, going down my list. And if somebody else has a porting problem, we can go down their list, But sometimes that stuff is very accidental. And if you read my, I don't have a reference to it here, but Common Lisp, The Untold Story. This is the URL in case anybody's like looking at it on video later or something. But you can also just Google that. You will see a lot of the detailed history of sort of how I got involved in this. So there's more depth available on some of these topics, but I'm going to try and sort of steer clear of that at this point and move on. Hopefully that's enough on that one. Sorry, I really do go on long on some of these things. I hope that won't scare people from asking questions. So I wanted to talk about programming language equivalence a little bit, just because everybody always cites Turing equivalence. It really bothers me, and I need to like write a blog essay or something on this question. But at least I'll just sort of highlight some thoughts here about why I don't really like Turing equivalence. So we'd like a language that's expressive, and so languages decide what will be easy to say and what will be hard to say. So they trade one form of expressiveness for another, and there can't be any best language. And this was a really difficult thing for me, especially as we were finishing the standard. We were going through a time where early on there weren't that many choices of languages, but there were starting to be, and there were starting to be arguments about like whether Lisp really was the best language. And I really didn't feel like it could be the best at everything. But it was necessary to say that for marketing reasons a lot of the time, because really people made an all or nothing decision that they were going to use this language or they're going to use that language. And there were not hybrid environments initially. And that's fortunately something that's changed. And I think it's a little easier to be honest about languages nowadays and to say, yeah, we got some weaknesses here. There's some things we could do a little better or something like that. I mean, Lisp does awfully well at a lot of things, so I didn't feel too bad about that. But it was partly just battle tested because we had these arguments all the time, and so things were constantly trying to respond to things. But the thing I'm trying to get at in trading easy for hard is that there's a set of programs that you could write that are, I don't know, I suppose you could order them like either in order of shortness or in order of like what you would think of, or maybe in the order of like how fast they'd run or something. It doesn't really matter what the ordering you pick. Just pick an ordering in your mind about what it's easy to do, and to say this program is, if we just took all the possible programs you could write and we said, look at the ones that are the easiest and sort them to the beginning of the line by whatever predicate you like. There's some set of reachable programs within a finite time that you might rationally expect you could realistically do. I mean, somebody could show you some program and you go like, I would never write that. There's not enough time in my lifetime to write that. We might reconsider that with ChatGPT, but I'm not going to go there for this talk. So I think all that does is expands the window, but that the window is still there. And so languages are choosing what will fit in an address space, or what representations will be efficient, or that kind of thing. And they'll be different for each language. Like that ordering is not the same for each language. So there are some programs that are reachable in finite time in one language that are not really reachable in another. The only way you can say that they're equivalent is if you have the infinite tape that a Turing machine has, and infinite time to watch the thing. I should have pulled up somebody actually built a thing which works like a Turing machine, and it's got a little video online, and you should look it up and watch it like erase zeros and ones and stuff from a tape, because it's hilarious and cool.
There's a few comments. I want to just go over them.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Okay, John Cowan asks, what was your high school 8K computer?
It was a Wang 2200S. It ran BASIC in hardware, and Wang did come out with one that ran it in software. I did not at the time really understand the difference. We kept trying to find our way out. We tried everything we could to figure out a way to get it to reveal that there was something outside of the stuff, but it was running BASIC in ROM, so there was no escaping it. But we were sure that we could trick it somehow and have it out. It had no operating system. It just ran BASIC from the moment it powered up, and that was pretty much it. We found some programs in magazines that were 32K, and we had to. My friend Dave Crowitz had invented a chain loader that would, when it needed to run code that didn't fit, would dispense with the code that was current somehow and store it somewhere, and then load up some other stuff, or maybe just discard it and have it loadable from tape and stuff. But anyway, he was able to run larger things. But yeah, it was quite a limited thing. Not like the IBM mainframe had a whole lot more memory, by the way. Those things did they were pretty limited as well. But we never ran into that limit, because in my Fortran class, like, the biggest programs we had were things where the teacher would say something like, write a program that compares two numbers read from cards and prints a 1 on the console if the first one is bigger than the second one and stuff. And I was so bored with that I wrote programs that would print 1 like at the size of a page by repeating the 1 all over the place. Yeah, it was a very small world back then. So did you have another question there? Guessing not. If there's more questions, go ahead and interrupt me again. So we talked about the fact. So I think of the expressivity is somehow related to this notion of reachable programs in finite time, or something like that. And in fact, at Symbolics, somebody had this written on their door, which I think also sort of captured the thing. Symbolics was the first commercial Lisp machine company, and had a picture of Zippy the Pinhead from cartoons next to it. So that was sort of the unofficial Symbolics mascot. So this notion that you can make certain problems easy always at the expense of making others hard was funny, but it was also true. So I don't know, it always stuck with me. I think expressive languages make intent perspicuous. I like this word perspicuous. I have a definition of it coming up here. And I like the notion of thinking about programming languages as being about not just implementing something, but expressing an idea. So when you make something perspicuous, you're saying you can look at it and you can tell what it is that it's doing. You don't have to execute it to figure out what it's doing. And that's one of the things that's lost in this whole notion of Turing equivalence when people compare by that. I just think that that's such a vacant metaphor. It's just not really very useful. So, like for example, if you, this prog statement will implement a loop, but this loop statement will actually do it. And I'm not against also using do. I didn't go through all the different ways you can do this in Lisp because we have a lot of different paradigms. But my point is that some of those paradigms very clearly say, hey, I'm trying to do a loop. And this particular way of saying it really kind of doesn't. So I think of a properly expressive program as minimizing the number of extra words you have to write that you don't really want to write, that you have an intuitive sense of how much you want to write down. If you want to say something and you don't know the syntax of the language, or you're going to have to look it up or something like that, you know kind of about how much you want to say, and then there's a bunch of extra noise that you end up having to write because that accommodates the language. And so I think that expressive languages make you write a minimum of noise and make it so that everything that you're writing down actually matters to what it is you're trying to accomplish. And they can do that in a variety of ways. Like a lot of people say, oh, I wouldn't really want to write all those parentheses or something like that. So we can debate whether or not that's a rational thing to want. But most Lisp programmers have come to grips with the fact that the parentheses mostly talk about groupings that are in fact meaningful and are not just there as random artifacts and stuff. So there's some justification for that. Although it's reasonable for someone to say that ergonomically they prefer infix languages in some circumstances. I get why they say that, and I use Python a lot in my day-to-day programming these days, and I don't find that it bothers me to use infix, except if I had a macro system, it would be harder. Unfortunately, Python doesn't have a macro system, so that works out well. So yeah, ergonomics is the other useful term here that is the term I'm sort of throwing around. And I think that sort of ergonomics is a measure. If you want a metric for it, my working hypothesis is that a good metric for that would be sort of the dissonance between how much you want to do and how much you're forced to do, or something like that. And that would tend to measure languages in an expressivity in a useful way that would let people compare them better. So that's all I wanted to say on that one. But going on to a next topic.
Yeah, and before you do, I just want to, I got a question from Aram in the conference. Part one, how do you feel the C machine model affected the design of programming languages nowadays versus the Lisp way was designed with respect to type systems, etc.? That's the first question.
I'm sorry. Which kind of machine am I asking about?
It's the C machine model. So I guess the way C views its machines versus the way Lisp views them.
Well,
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
C is really operating at a subprimitive level, so it's not really enforcing anything. I mean, I sort of.
So you were. I'll give some clarification on this question. I was just wondering, because the C machine model, like you said, is pretty primitive with respect to how types are kind of represented and things. You were kind of earlier on explaining how a lot of languages kind of have been figuring out, well, what could be fit into an address space is probably a decision that they've been making, and then they tried to add some additional checks. Do you feel that C a lot of those decisions, at least with respect to modern programming and design, is a result of the fact that they started with such a simple machine model versus the way Lisp was kind of designed, where it was, we're not entirely sure what the machine is. So they tried different things, and they had a little bit more sort of an exploratory space, so to speak, before things were kind of standardized. At least based on my reading of history, you have more experience in that. So.
No, I have different experience. So I'm not a career C programmer, so let me just say that right off the bat. I've done a little C programming, but not enough to really claim any credential in that area. But I'm certainly well familiar with what C does. And I'm not sure, when we talk about that it starts with a certain model already, I'm a little iffy on that, because I mean, the PDP-11, I think, was the original model for C, maybe. And even there, you had a certain model of a machine, but it wasn't the machine that was actually implemented in a lot of places. And so there was a lot of interestingness around that particular thing. And Lisp, in fairness, the early Lisp machines had, they were microcoded, and they had a lot of control primitives for being able to do that same kind of layout. They did it in a different architecture, and all the details were completely different. You can go do some research on early Lisp machine manuals to see how they managed that. It was even before the package system and stuff, so there's a lot of operators that usually started with like percent or %p or something like that as their prefix or something, so you didn't accidentally call one of those functions yourself or something. But you could lay out individual data layouts in the early machines. Later on, they worked through microcoded, gate array, silicon. There was an evolution there of different ways of composing the low-level machine. I think C has succeeded in sort of carving out the space of being the underlying platform that is used to bootstrap a lot of this stuff. Although, I mean, there's WebAssembly and other things like that now that, people might pick as an alternative thing, Java even, as, different bases that one could be. And that's one of the things where I was like, I just don't want to be in the fight over whether Lisp is the right language for that. I mean, there were Lisp dialects where this could be done quite well, but it was a lot of energy put into that. And whether that's the thing that most of the Lisp programmers really cared about, or whether it was just kind of a pointless fight just to say we could do it or something like that. It was, some of it gets into the question of even what is it to be a Lisp? Because if you look at all the various different Lisp dialects, and I did one time trying to find what the common thing is that's in all of them. I'm trying to remember. There's almost nothing that's shared universally within everything. I think they all maybe have cons, and maybe they even all call it that. I don't think they agree on first and rest, car cooter, that kind of thing, because those kinds of things differ. The nature of what the data types are and how equality works and all that kind of stuff varies. So there's a lot of stuff that's different, and Lisp is sort of, and this was one reason why John McCarthy asked that when we were working on the international standard for Lisp, John asked us to not call it the standard for Lisp, and that's why we made it ISLISP, which you might think stands for International Standard for Lisp, but it does not. It's just a made-up name so that it would not be the word Lisp that we made a standard for, so that nobody really owns that name, and it's more just a concept or a philosophy, kind of free for you to figure out how you want to personally come to that sort of thing. But I think that the essential thing for me, and the thing I like about the Lisp models, is kind of, I'm in the same camp as like the .NET people or something like that, that basically it's nice to have the data structures be something that you can rely on being there and not accidentally fall out through some language operation into a world where operators that you thought were semantically well formed really aren't, because you didn't get a valid pointer or something like that. I like working in a world where we can disagree over whether or not I should have passed you an apple or an orange or something like that, but we shouldn't be disagreeing about whether or not I should have passed you data at all, or an object at all. I like that things answer to the described protocol, or that kind of thing. So hopefully that helps. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about language design versus language standards. We did talk about this a little bit before, so I'll kind of rush through. I do want to point out that standards are about not getting sued, which is maybe not the first thing you think about when you think about standards. Like when we started the ANSI process, and you can read more about this in the Common Lisp, The Untold Story. We had just come out of having published the first book, which was just published as a sort of private endeavor, really. I mean, Steele published the book. I mean, a bunch of us got together and did some voting and stuff, and there were the 5 principal authors of the thing. But it wasn't an official standard. It was just something that got used by a bunch of people, and it helped to persuade DARPA that they shouldn't cancel the funding, so that was important. But a couple of years after the publication of that book, we got together in Monterey, and users came, and we were talking about changes to the language, and the users were like, we want some say in that. And those of us who had been involved in the design were like, why should you get a say? That's our language. And it was a real evolution of understanding for me personally. I don't know how many others went through the same thing, to understand that there was actually merit in having the people who only had used the language and hadn't designed it to say, no, this is my language too. That without involving them and recognizing that their stake is as real as the people who designed the language, that we were not going to really have a community. But then we didn't know how to vote because there seemed like there were lots more of them than us, and we would lose control, or we would not even understand how to do the voting. And so that's the main reason why we took on this standards work, was to get some sense of a voting system. So a representative of ANSI came to the meeting and said, you know, our main job is to not get sued, and on the side we try to make standards. And I thought they were just joking, but they were really not. There's under antitrust law, companies cannot agree to do things a certain way with other companies because they might accidentally hurt the business of other companies. That's called collusion, and it's not allowed. And so under standards, you can do it, but the standards umbrella requires that. That's why they talk about accredited standards institutions, or accredited standards organizations, is that they, somewhere along the way, there's been some blessing of their procedure for resolving issues and for making sure that everybody has an appropriate say and that nobody gets rolled over by just the big guys or something. And so the rules actually give quite a bit of say to the small organizations. And I thought that was an interesting aspect of the whole standardization thing. And this is some of my point here in this talk, is that standards are a social matter, and a lot of this stuff is a social matter, and the details of social matters really matter. And you're used to thinking like there's this sort of tyranny of the majority and people need rights against it. And it's not just a matter of majorities, it's a matter of like who's putting in a lot of money. And the little guys could find themselves edged out. And so the rules allowed even a small company to say, hey, that thing you're doing, that's going to be a real problem for my business. And if you do that, I'll be put out of business. And they can pretty much stop the standard in its tracks and make people say, well, what kind of accommodation do you need so that what we're doing is not going to injure you? And so that isn't exactly about voting, but it is about fairness. And so it's worth thinking about that. It's also worth thinking about the fact that the fairness rules were a big, thick book, and that only certain people probably took the time to read it, and that therefore the people that read it had an edge over the people who didn't. And so the very creation of a bunch of standards, a bunch of rules for fairness became a way to work away from fairness. That there's no perfect answer to the issue of fairness. Fairness is like a work in progress. And it's weird that even an attempt to be more fair can backfire sometimes, or at least have complexity. And so we did see some of that as well. So fairness is hard, but one of the things that it was about is this issue of, who gets a vote and what constitutes consensus. And so the rules of ANSI dictated that, and the rules of IEEE would have dictated something different, and so on. And at the time, we really didn't know. We just knew we had some people that liked ANSI, and so we just did it that way. We really didn't shop very well. I don't know if we would have made a different decision if we had shopped more, but I think we just kind of worked inertially and went that way. So the thing I want to say here also is that sometimes you think of philosophy as a separate endeavor from the law, but I often have found that there are pockets of law which are really just philosophy that has sort of grown up to be important enough that somebody has had to cast it into law and say, this is the way we're going to do things. Because sometimes you think of philosophy as kind of an irrelevance. I mean, I had a philosophy teacher in college who would prefix a lot of the things he would teach us with saying, here's another thing that you can tell people at cocktail parties. Because it was like he had such low self-esteem that he didn't think that philosophy was going to be useful for anything else. But it seems to me that philosophy is the difference between right and wrong decisions. And I don't mean just correct and incorrect, but I mean just and unjust decisions in any complex space. And so anyway, it's worth thinking about the fact that this is a kind of blurry topic, but that philosophers are not to be ignored. Of course, I have a degree in philosophy, so I have to disclaim the fact that maybe I'm just trying to make myself sound more important. But speaking to that degree, I also want to say that Aristotle said that virtue is the golden mean between unreasonable extremes. He had this whole notion of virtue ethics where he said things like, if you're a spendthrift, that's not a good thing. But if you're if you are overly miserly, that's not a good thing either. And that somewhere in between, there's what he felt was a golden mean, like that could almost be mathematically computed, where that was the place where virtue was halfway between the unreasonable extremes. Rush Limbaugh, on the other hand, and I used to listen to him a lot because why listen to people that agree with me? He used to say that extremes were the only principled thing in the world, and that if you muddied them up by compromising with people, that you were being unprincipled. I didn't really like that either. And so my belief is that Aristotle was closer to right in that there is a place in the middle where you have to compromise with people, but I don't think it's a single place. I think it's a place where you just kind of get to, and it's your working approximation for the moment. And that what makes it valid is not that you found the right place, but that you're willing to defend the place you found, and that you're willing to change if you need to. So I call that the messy middle. It's elusive, and it's often prone to people claiming hypocrisy, and you have to defend yourself against that. But the reason why I think that it is that way is that the world itself is over-constrained. We almost always start out with way more constraints than we could reasonably, certainly socially anyway, than we could reasonably satisfy. And so if you look for hypocrisy, if you do the standard thing you do in logic, where you look for an answer that is free of contradiction, you aren't going to find one, or you're going to find somebody trying to claim that because you found a contradiction that you're wrong, which doesn't even make sense, because contradictions are like the price of admission to being able to be in any of these debates. They just open with contradiction, and you have to have some form of logic that transcends that. And so I call it the messy middle. And a lot of the compromises that we made are sort of subject to that kind of thing. I talked already, and I'm not going to belabor the point here because I'm running long. And I do want to finish this in time for more questions, including possibly some that are off camera, so that people who are shy about cameras can talk. But standardization is not design. So it's what you do after you've done design, when you need to refine the design or you need to reconcile multiple designs. This is a haiku that I wrote that isn't exactly applicable here because nobody's paying us in the standardization business. But at the same time, if you substitute, like for pay, maybe interest or take interest in us or something like that, maybe it has some relevance. Users are an annoyance and an essential thing because always they're criticizing you, or they're telling you something's not working, or they're pointing out something where you have to work harder to make things go, and so on. So having worked at a lot of companies that crank out either languages or compilers or things like that, it's like one of those things where, of course, I mean, we on other days are users ourselves. And so I'm not even meaning to diss people. I'm just saying that there is a kind of paradox even about that, where the price of success is that things run slower. And people often criticize Common Lisp because it uses names that are old-fashioned, and why didn't we pick better names and stuff like that. But on the other hand, we did what we did because that was what would make us successful. And the only way we could have just redesigned everything would have been to throw the user community aside and try and build a new community. And I don't think we could have done that. So that's just complicated. I wanted to say too that the X3J13 issues, which you'll, if you're a user of the hyperspec at all, it's one of the features that is not part of the original standard. The original standard was an 1150 page document. And by the way, it was originally a 1300 and something, I think it was 1395 pages or something. We went to 1150 pages by reducing out interline white space and a few other book design things like that. So that's worth noting that when you have big documents like that, that weird things can matter, changing
So
sizes and
actually, Larry has a question. So Larry, if you want to unmute, ask your question.
Or a comment. Larry, go ahead.
You had a lot of comments on the side chat, but go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Let's see if it. Let me see if I can. Let's see. I can send a message to.
While we're waiting for that, I just wanted to thank you for the hyperspec. It's so useful. I use it all the time. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, I resisted putting in, people kept saying like, put in that Java thing or something. I was really worried that anything that I put in that looked modern, I apologize for the old-fashioned nature of it, but I worked hard to put in only things that I thought would be enduring. It was kind of an experiment, and I seem to have gambled correctly that it would still function in modern browsers, which is quite an amazing thing.
To me, I look at the hyperspec as sort of like, you know, a great thing about seeing it today is that we kind of forget with, like, you know, Facebook and everything, what the web was really about, which was just links, and links to everything is linked to everything else. So like in the hyperspec, it's crazy. I was like, oh, a class. What do they mean by class? Click on that, get to the definition, and you see it. Oh, type up. Oh, click on that, you get to the function. It's just it's a fantastic microcosm of that. Besides being a great way to learn the language.
It's probably hard to look at because like I went to read Lord of the Rings and I was like, oh God, all that wizards and trolls stuff, that's been done. But of course, it was done because of Lord of the Rings. If you enter at the wrong place in history, you don't sort it out correctly. Because like this has a Wikipedia-like look, but when I originally did it in 1994, the typical web page was gray, and it said, "Hi, this is my web page, and I know another guy that has one, and here's a link," and that's all it said. There were not like search engines or anything. It took me a year and a half to get my company to agree to release it. And so we did at least a little bit of tuning on it, but basically it was ready to go long before. And I thought by the time it came out, I thought nobody would care. But like at that same time, when this typical web page had like one link, this has like 106,000 106,000 links, 106 kilo hyperlinks, I call them. And it was 15 megabytes. So it was bigger than the typical web page was at the time. And Wikipedia didn't exist. It has a very Wikipedia kind of look. I always like to think that maybe they got inspired by having seen mine, but I'm sure that they never saw it.
So Larry, are you able to speak?
I think so.
Oh, go. Yeah,
Okay.
There you go.
All right. So I had a couple of comments that are kind of related. Mm-hmm. One, I think we kind of didn't do a very good job on the Common Lisp standard. because we left so much to be implementation dependent. It was a good cop out. You had two sides that were disagreeing, and you found some way of saying this part is standard and this part is implementation dependent, so that the implementations could go on and do what they wanted to. And that favors the makers of the readers. Their job is easier, but the makers of the writers, the authors, wind up writing things that work only in one implementation and not in another. Because we didn't have the objective of interoperability as high as it should have been. Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, I mean, no, but I don't think that it's an unfair analysis. I mean, I really am a strong believer in the fact that my opinion is not the unique opinion. So I totally appreciate your bringing that in. So I'll say why I disagree, and then you can maybe respond to that. But I mean, first of all, I think you can't do everything. So I think we did what could be done in the time. So I think that it was successful in that regard, and it has survived. So been successful in that regard. But in terms of interoperability, I mean, as I said before, I mean, I went through all my notes with Maxima, and I tried to fix as many things as I could about what were the portability problems. So it was like specifically about making it possible to do that. And I did the same thing with ISLISP. When we did that standard, I came back to we had not quite closed the ANSI Common Lisp standard. And I said, like, we're going to need some things. I think some sort of stuff for defining Lambda macros and things like that were examples of things. And we had some productive discussion about what to do about global lexicals and so on, which got a little messy. But in any case, there was a genuine attempt to worry about portability, and it was embraced by the community. Like, people, we didn't fix everything, but and I by the way, I should say about Larry, who's asking this question, Larry Macinter, that like this whole thing, the whole X3J3, this is his baby, and it was an extraordinary job of like just keeping track of all of this stuff. It was a big administrative nightmare, and there was a lot of complexity to it. So he's sort of criticizing himself here, and I don't know that. So partly I'm defending.
I said
him.
we.
Yeah, I know, but yeah, but I think, you know, give yourself more credit. Yeah. So, and also I think that one of the things I was going to say in here is, if you look at these individual things, another thing I sort of thought it was not really the right thing. There was a lot of these things these stories I'm telling about, things where when I first came to them, I was like, oh, this is completely wrong. And I'm telling you about these things because I've since come to understand that I was wrong and that these things are really good. And so, like, the whole administrative thing here has got a problem description. I just picked one of these at random. This is what's proposed. There's a rationale. There's discussion of current practice, cost to implementer, cost to users, a whole thing like this. Like, the exact form we use tended to vary. So some of these have, you know, cost of non-adoption and other kinds of weird fields like that. But the idea that we would do a breakdown analysis like this seemed like a lot of business that I wasn't sure was worth doing, but it was worth doing. And I thought it did pretty well. And also, these descriptions we forced everybody to come together in these descriptions and to come up with a common problem description that then people could make multiple proposals against. So sometimes this one has only one proposal. Some of them had multiple proposals. And so individuals would make these, and we did not force people to work on these. So these things tended to be coherent, at least, and to try to address the common problem, so that you would have like several different ways that we could discuss, like, oh, I like that way, or I like this way, or something like that. And again, Larry's to be given a lot of credit for this, because I don't think we could have made the sheer number of decisions we had to make in that period of time. And so much of this was about budget. This took, like, I think $500,000 in enumeratable costs, and there was a lot of behind the scene costs that I can't really enumerate, of people like spending time preparing stuff or taking individual airplane flights and stuff like that, that were other things, such that just to say we could have done better is to say we could have either been remarkably insightful and done all of that part differently, which we didn't, and therefore I don't think we could have, or else to say we would have spent more budget, and we did not have more budget to spend. So that's my theory on the subject, but I don't know. You want to respond?
Well, I had taken the training class in Xerox on problem-solving process, and I took this to heart. And I've often claimed that my greatest contribution to Common Lisp was designing the form you had to fill out in order to get a change to the language. That you had to
I show people that form all the time in all sorts of other forums as an example of something good. I think you're right on that.
Yeah, that you had to describe the problem without describing your proposed solution.
Right, exactly. That it could not be I remember now that one of the problem descriptions could not be, we need an ATAN function, and then proposal, make one or something. It was supposed to be different than that. Yes, I think.
And then you had to describe your proposal without arguing for it.
Right.
And then you had to describe costs to users and implementers and benefits to users and implementers without any testimonials. You put all the thing about David Moon like this, and as all of the testimonials and other kind of circumstances, and that when people wanted to argue about the features, that they had to argue first. Oh, there's another cost that you didn't have. Oh, there's a benefit that isn't really. Make you get them to agree that the forms are filled out correctly.
Yes.
Or they argue over, well, we think this implementer cost is small compared to the user benefit.
Right, and so this is very key to the. I'm really glad you're making these points, because this is very key to why I chose this particular topic and where I'm talking about life lessons and so on. Is that there are ways you can design process so that it just railroads something through, and then there are ways you can design process so that there's some hope that there actually is real fairness in these things. And this it was administrative, but it was important in a way that I sort of came to really understand and appreciate that these things do matter, that it matters to know, what problem am I trying to solve? Like, I wish Congress would have associated with every bill an actual problem that they were trying to solve, a set of metrics for telling whether or not it's been successful or not, for something like that. Because I think a lot of the stuff that we do where we fuss about things back and forth end up getting away from the actual issues trying to be solved. And I think that this was a really good way of being able to get people to sort of stay on topic and to really solve the problem that they came there to solve. So I think it's not just in your head, Larry. I think that was really quite important. I also give credit to Susan Ennis for doing the charter. I don't have the X3J13 charter here. But this was the chart. The charter was a document that the purposes, it just seemed to me to be so administrative, and we wasted, I thought wasted, but not wasted, a whole meeting on it, just coming up with the wording of this. But it turns out that getting everybody to agree on why we were there was tremendously important. This particular sentence here was so important to get said early on before we got to the places where it mattered. To be able to say, we're not here to discuss aesthetics. Like, the aesthetics were in the original document. We do the best we can to preserve them. But ultimately, when it comes to the compromises, if something isn't exactly perfectly aesthetic, it's subordinate. It's not a non-consideration, it's a subordinate consideration. And that was key to breaking deadlocks between people who had disagreed, because you could when you have people that are not working for one another, when you are not their boss, you cannot break the deadlock by just saying, I'm going to fire you if you don't know. You're stuck with the people that you're stuck with. And your only tool is cognitive dissonance, the ability to say to the other person, look, you agreed you're going to be part of this. Like, you go back to the agreements that you had with the other person, and you get the person to say, you're not doing it because of me. You're doing it because you said you would do this. And everybody said they agreed with this. And so we were able to point back to this and say, earlier you agreed with this. Let's just move on. So yeah, it's tricky to be able to figure out how to make progress in worlds like this. But I think that was key. Did you have anything else before I move on?
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Or-
Feel free to break in with more stuff like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do have some questions from YouTube, so I want to relay those
Sure.
to you.
Okay.
One from MePlan. Do you think it's a good idea to make a new version of the standard of Common Lisp, maybe with an ISO this time?
So those are two different questions, very, very different questions. Do I think it's a good to make a new version of the standard? So we always imagined that there would be layered standards. So I was sort of expecting that the next thing would be like library things. In fact, I started a thing, not wanting to go through the whole overhead of things. I sort of broke down the notion of what is a standard really. It's really, in my mind, it's really two things. One is you write something down and you put it in a place where it's permanent. So you could just put it on your website and just, I don't know, commit some dollars to having that website always exist. And okay, that's taken care of. Now, as long as it never changes, then you're good on that. Now, the only other part of a standard is forcing people to use it. That's the hard part. And in fact, like, there's a joke in the standards community that the nice thing about standards is that there's so many of them. I mean, people don't even use standards, but the thing about a standard is that if at least some people agree to it and there's some belief that people are using it, then you will get that you have some hope of solving the prisoner's dilemma, where you're wanting to write just one half of a program, like a protocol, or you want to write a program but you don't want to write the compiler. You want to write the compiler but not the program. If you're working with a standard, you can have a hope of winning on that. If you're working with some private piece of stuff, then you won't. So I think that standards are a good idea, and I think evolving it, not a terrible idea, but if you change it incompatibly, you'll lose some number of users. And so you need to make a calculus about splitting the community versus bringing them along and how to do that most effectively. So it's a tricky business. The business about ISO is, that has to do with who's going to be voting and whose rules you're using. It's the same as going to IEEE or another kind of thing, really, even though it seems different because it's nations. But it's a forum in which standards can be created. And there your voting bodies are odd because, like the US, which has an awful lot of users, gets one vote. And one of the things that was raised as kind of a specter early on to get us to get involved in ISO at all was someone making the claim that there could become somebody in some, now we're in a global community and in a public forum and stuff, so I won't say like which countries were cited, if even they were. I probably don't even remember, but there was some notion that some obscure country that didn't have any interest in Lisp could suddenly take an interest with 3 of its friends and outvote everybody else, and then there would be an ISO standard that we weren't in control of, and that if we didn't rush to affirmatively fill the gap that somebody else did, that we were going to be in trouble. I think this is how nuclear weapons get done, in the same way, by claiming not that you want nuclear weapons, but what if somebody else got there first, and so you'd better rush in and defensively put something in place. So I just don't know about ISO as a place to do that. But I will say that no standards should be started without first doing the thing and then standardizing it. So if somebody has a plan for what they want to do, the place to start is not standards, in my opinion. the place to start is by just doing the thing and see if anybody shows up. Like make your own thing and don't have it be a standard thing, and just see, are there people using it, and is it getting adopted? Because I think my impression is that I've been mostly in the Python community lately, so I haven't been following Common Lisp or Lisp in general super closely in the last few years. But my impression is that what's done is done informally, and that's the kind of thing that should be subject to standards. So hopefully that answers your question. Larry might have an opinion on this as well, but
I mean, that sounds like a good answer to me.
Okay.
I'll find out on the chat. But
Okay.
also, Ezekiel, who's in the conference, would like to ask you a question. So, Ezekiel, go ahead.
Hi. No, it was just a quick comment. Would it be possible to enlarge or click on slideshow to enlarge the presentation?
Does that help enough?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I appreciate your mentioning that. Yeah. Okay. So let me proceed on. I'm trying to get through some of them. I don't have a huge number of other slides, but I did want to just touch on a couple of things just to raise them as issues, because they might have gone past your awareness. I did want to say something about keyboards. The Lisp machine, this is a picture of my keyboard. I went looking at other people's pictures of keyboards earlier, and I finally decided I would just go to the effort to upload a photo of my own. But so this is from my Mac Ivory, which hasn't been running recently, but I do have it. It did run the last time I brought it up. It's just noisy, and I worry about it running all the time. So, but I want to say something about places in this section of the talk is really to highlight some issues, again, of community, because there's so much we talk about the technical reasons why we do things. And I think it's important to understand the personal and human effects of some of these things. So hyphens versus underscores. I had a lot of friends with carpal tunnel syndrome, and they were very sensitive to the use of underscore because they had to use the shift key to get to the underscore. So Lisp's use of hyphens is not entirely accidental. It's also a community of people that really liked the fact that hyphen was an unshifted key, and as a connective character did not require them to do extra work with their ailing fingers. Especially nowadays, I'm like suffering a lot from osteoarthritis, fortunately not of the hands, only of the hips, but I can certainly relate to the fact of all of that kind of pain. And so it was a kindness that was done to choose the hyphens. Now, hyphens are generally a lowercase character on most keyboards, so I didn't call out those in particular. But also on this keyboard and the Lisp machine keyboards, there were several different designs. Some called the Space Cadet keyboard. This is technically not a Space Cadet keyboard, but it's in the same spirit. This is the Symbolics keyboard. The Space Cadet keyboard was the original one for the Lisp machine that was called a CADR, C-A-D-R, which was the, actually not the first. There was a Cons, I believe, was the first Lisp machine, not counting the other branch of evolution, which is the Medley series, and I'm not sure how those went, but at least on the East Coast Lisp machines, the keyboards had this particular, like Symbolics one had a colon that you could type either upper or lowercase. This is not a dot for uppercase and a dot for lowercase. This is an actual colon. Most of the keys had two things on them, so that was pretty useful for package prefixes. And then for parentheses, they were unshifted here. They were still available, I think, they're in the 9 and the 0. They're still shifted. But there were extra parentheses that were in a lowercase position for people that didn't feel like shifting. Also, rub outs in a completely different place to where the very useless caps lock key is that got repurposed to rub out. And that was super useful to be able to hit rub out without taking your fingers off the home row. So those were just some ergonomic issues that manifested in hardware that I thought were interesting. And I wanted to say about programming languages also, I mean, this is just kind of a hodgepodge of little issues that I just wanted to raise because when else would there be a time to raise them? It would be nice if languages were a kind of a personal choice thing. Like if we could work together on a project where I worked in one language and you worked in another language. And to some extent, that's what .NET does. And to a lesser extent, what the Java virtual machine does. .NET, I think, did a far better job of really allowing a lot of co-resident languages to use the same set of data structures and to call each other. But there are various reasons why in the larger world, that's complicated because you end up in cases where the data structures don't exactly align. And even though I might choose one language and you might choose another, when it comes to cross-calling, it gets pretty complicated doing the call-outs and the whole business of what's native and what's foreign and, you know, whose data layouts are you using and so on, does get messy. So it's doable, but the ideal of just having this be an entirely separate choice is not quite doable. But as happens for a lot of these things, there are metaphors in the language and outside the language for how society, it helps me think about societal differences that, and this quote comes from the first Computers, Freedom, and Privacy Conference in San Francisco in 1991. John Gilmore gave this little extemporaneous speech that is available here. It's kind of the longer talk is also interesting. But this quote I thought in particular was important, that the relationship between privacy and sort of your ability to have behaviors that don't hurt anybody, that as soon as you expose what it is that you're doing, then people can menace you and call you names and all the things that people like to do about Lisp when they don't really understand why we use it. It would be nice if it were a little more of a private decision. And I've often wondered whether if I could do it over again, whether I would do language standards or data structure standards, because in some sense, some of this is about the failure to really have a good set of data structures. Like it's nice that Python has a list structure, for example, or has a list data type, but it would be nice if the list data type was not what I call an array data type. And it would be nice if the thing that I call a list or a cons had more of a prominent first class kind of status. So when I did a casting of the error system for Common Lisp into Python as an exercise, and I've meant to publish it as a paper, but I've been too busy. I probably, if I get some time, I'll just put up a GitHub repo at this point. I'm just tired of having it be only with me. But yeah, that kind of issue, it can't really be hidden, I guess is all I'm trying to say here. So I'm just going to continue down my random walk of curious things. The namespacing issue was an interesting social question because we wanted to. The part of what I'm trying to get at here with these examples that I'm doing are how hard we worked to make a community be a single community. Because we really wanted people to feel like they were all part of something and not like they had to go elsewhere to be other. And that's a thing that society struggles with a lot. And sometimes you have to go to extra effort in order to bring people into the community. So it was a tricky problem about the namespacing because we tried as hard as we could to allow a functional style without giving up the other things that we also wanted to allow. If you go into the Scheme community, they have the functional style obviously done better, but I think have done less work to really allow the object-oriented style or the, sort of more imperative styles and so on. So So the charter document was helpful here for helping us resolve some conflicts over this, but this was a genuinely hard issue. Common Lisp did end up supporting multiple paradigms. You can write things that look sort of functional. Functional is obviously not the forced version of how you're supposed to program in Common Lisp. You have options. You can choose one or another, but we did what we could to make the functional programming fit well within the context of programs that do other kinds of things. And I think that that's a real credit to Common Lisp, even if some people might criticize it as being kind of a kitchen sink thing where we threw in a lot of different things. The point was to allow a multicultural society. And if you look at it through that lens, I think it can help you understand why it's got some extra stuff. This is the kind of thing that you end up with otherwise, where like this sort of describes my contest with the scheme world, where basically they just wanted there to be two namespaces or one namespace, for example, and we wanted there to be two. We use two as a proxy for really many, because depending on how you count, probably Common Lisp has 3 or 4 or 5 things. Certainly has blocks and tags and other things as sort of small namespaces.
I can't remember them off the top of my head, but Paradigms of Artificial Intelligence Programming says there are 7.
That's possible. I mean, it depends. Like, there's the type namespace is kind of a weird namespace that is kind of odd, and the class namespace, arguably, some of the things, like the ones that look like real variables and operate like real variables, there are 4 of them, which are the blocks, tags, variables, and functions. But they start to get a little more wonky when they go a little more heavily toward, like, even the function one, like there's some operators for peeling out functions in a functional way as well as other ways. And the same with the class system. But there's no way to talk about a class as if it was like a variable exactly. So whether or not you still count that as a namespace is kind of personal choice. But the point is, we want more ways of thinking about things. That was sort of one of the principal values. I think we also worked really hard on the case sensitivity thing. And we had people who were really dead set on that they wanted lowercase, and some of it because of that issue, again, of carpal tunnel syndrome, and some because of some traditional things, some because people wanted case insensitivity and other people wanted case sensitivity. And then the question was, like, what do you put internally in something and how do you get it? And I think we worked awfully hard to hide as many cases where that mattered as possible, and to allow communities that, you know, were practically at each other's throats to coexist. And so I'm not going to call out the solution that we did as the best solution. It's kind of an example of the messy middle I was talking about before. But what I want you to see as a success is the fact of caring about people other than yourself. That most of these variables are things that you would set a certain way and never ever set it differently, but that other people would set differently. And just the willingness to have those variables there, and not just to say, well, why don't we just vote out those other people and make the language simpler, I think is a success for the language. And another thing that, and this goes a little bit to the question of should there be more standards, is that we tried to put control in the hands of users. So if you can do a thing, if the system can do a thing, we wanted user programs to do that too. We weren't perfect about that. There's some places where there's still some stuff that's missing, but then an awful lot of the things that people criticize in Common Lisp can also be overcome by using some of the programmability things, by changing read tables, or by changing, by using clever macros and eval when and all kinds of other things that would just allow you to work your way around choices by changing what's in a certain package, or you know, there's a lot of things that are there for the purpose of allowing you to make the environment the way you want. Another thing that I need to sometime do is to I made some tools for myself when I once a long time ago wrote a web server in Lisp, and I never ended up publishing it. Franz came out with one, and I really didn't want to compete with it, so I just put mine on mothballs and never did anything with it. But it has some underlying tools for like def system. It has a def system that's sort of like a combination of a package definition and a system definition. It's a little like the way Java does things. I just decided I didn't need a standard to do that. I could do that myself because we had made tools to do that, and other people can do that too.
And just to follow up on that,
yeah.
Sorry, just 1 second, because MePlan, who asked the question about the, updating the standard, responded, and he said, "Thanks for the answer. I was thinking about standardizing things multiple implementations already do, but are missing in the ANSI document."
Yeah,
So
those are things for which a layered standard could be sufficient and would not split the community. I started to talk about substandards and I didn't quite finish it. I think people didn't like the name. I actually took substandards.org for a while and tried to get people interested in the idea of just writing down little things that they thought might be useful things to adhere to and stuff. But it was hard to get vendor interest. I mean, figuring out exactly how to promote that and organize it is, again, like one of those things that probably Larry Macinter has that kind of organizational understanding of how to do better than I do. Or, there will be somebody that will come along that will have the energy to, do this new because they won't realize how hard it is and they'll just dive in and they'll do it well. And that's somehow how these things go. So I think that there's an opportunity to do things there, but it should be done with consideration for the community, I think, and trying to figure out like how to not splinter the community, because it's a small community. And the reason why Common Lisp came together at all was to keep it from being, it was because we realized at some point that even though we were competing companies, there were many, or competing vendors, even some of them at universities, that compared to like, C++ at the time was the big thing, or maybe Java was coming in or something like that, that those were the things that were the threats to our survival, that we were not each other threats to it. But we can, in a small community, easily slice things up so that there's not critical mass. With a lot of open source around, it's hard to kill things anymore. It used to be that everything, there was a lot more commercial stuff and that things could really die a kind of more permanent death. Now they can just kind of end up in this kind of languishing morass that, maybe could survive that. But it would be nice to see a healthy community. So anybody trying to do that should just be careful.
I just have. Oh, go ahead.
I mentioned Evalwen before, so I'm not going to really get into that.
I thought someone else.
I do have another topic to get to, but go ahead. This is a good place to ask questions. Go ahead.
Just one more from YouTube. I just want to. Paul McGee said very tangential, maybe a little tangential, or not on topic, but when and how did continuations come to Lisp? Do you have any insight on that, in your perspective?
I am not sure who's responsible for continuations existing. It seemed to be something that was in the Scheme standard. I do not think it predates. A lot of Scheme, like the lexical scoping and the block structure, came from Algol 60, but and some of those things came from Smalltalk is the only other place that I could imagine continuations could have come from. But you'd have to go and look elsewhere. I'm not the source of authority on where continuations came from. And they're not really, in practice, first-class continuations are not present in Common Lisp, although there's some reason to think of restarts as sort of limited continuations. But that's a kind of a different business. I have a little more to say on that. If there's some extra time at the end, possibly in the chat afterwards, I could talk on. I don't want this talk to go on forever, but I don't have a whole lot more to say on continuations here, I think. Is there any other questions?
Yeah, that's it on the YouTube side. I'll
Okay.
save the ones that are in the comments till at the end if you want to continue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have one more kind of little thing that I want to get to, and that's that I want to say that the Lisp community has a difference to it. It's unique and special, I guess, is the thing I'm trying to say. Besides different, we think things through, and I'm not saying that there's no thought in other language communities. I don't want to be quite that disparaging or anything, but if one were on autopilot in learning languages, one would not end up in the Lisp community. Let's just say that. You get here by thinking about things a little bit of a different way. And so I think that self-selected as the typical Lisp user is a little different than the typical programmer on the street, I guess, is the thing that I'm trying to say. And I want to highlight a quote that I got from Amar Bose, who was he was a professor at MIT, and he founded the Bose Corporation. But he was talking at the MIT Enterprise Forum, which was like a business study group, that about the difficulty of selling Bose speakers and how the salespeople would complain a lot about how they had to set them up differently, other things, and they're like, why can't they be the same? And we hear that a lot about Lisp, like why can't it be like other languages and has to, why doesn't it use infix, and why doesn't it do this and that and the other? And the problem is, the same thing that they eventually concluded with their speaker systems, and they had to have some way to explain to them why does it have to be different. Is that better implies different, that you can't be both better and the same, that's not a meaningful thing. To become different, to become better, you have to be different. So Lisp takes a stand on that. Other people take different stands, but it's a stand that we appreciate and defend. And so that's sort of something that brings us together as a community, is that some of us like to think that this or that is different. Some of us think everything is this or that is better. Some people think everything is better, but at least we're unified by the fact that we're a little quirky. And we like going meta. We like not just writing programs, but we write programs that write programs. We write domain-specific languages and compilers and like that kind of thing. So I think that says something about our community too, that makes it special. And so I wanted to end on this plea, which is, do not just use what Lisp teaches you only for doing Lisp. Look to the lessons that Lisp brings you about how to think about things, about how to think about problems to solve more than just what Lisp is doing. I mean, it's fine if you want to use Lisp to solve problems, that's all great. But when you go home at the end of the evening, and those of you who do and who don't just work all the time, we have a democracy that is ailing in the US, and really there are no democracies that are not at some sort of risk around the globe, sadly. And the climate is very much at risk. And so people ask me, like, what have I been doing? Expecting sometime maybe I've been doing some cool Lisp thing or something. And I do sometimes do things, but I've been spending more and more of my time on worrying, if I have free time that's not going to work, worrying about the climate and worrying about democracy, because I don't think that we can have, frankly, a successful Lisp world or any world at all if we don't solve these problems. So don't let this sneak up on you. Make sure that you spend some time on that. Make sure you apply some of the kind of kindness and the caring that I think that I've tried to highlight in the community here to helping the world become a better place. I do, this time of year, I wrote in 2008 a poem that's about the night before Christmas, and I will let me post this into the chat on the thing. Now, yeah, go into infinite regression, and maybe I can find the chat long enough to paste this. So I will hope that everybody will go there and read my climate poem. I wrote it originally in English. I've translated it now to Spanish and Portuguese, by which I mean I've engaged really excellent friends who are native speakers of that have helped me with that. And I did have some input into both of those translations, so I'm a co-author on both of those. But there's some audio versions of that too, if you want to play those. When I wrote it in 2008, I was thinking that it seemed so quaint and far off, the issue of the Arctic melting. But at the same time, I was sort of pegging human extinction to be somewhere around 2035. So you might disagree with me on that. Lately, I disagree with me on that too. I think it's going to be sooner, or at least civilization collapse. We are in a lot of problem. And so don't just be nerds all the time, because many of you are very, very, very smart people that could be applying that to fixing some of the world's problems. So with that, I'll end the formal part of this. I do have tons of other materials, including I have two other artifacts, one of which is I have my hypertext editor and a demonstration of that. It's kind of cool because I hard copied the thing from back in 1984 when I made it, because I was worried the computer wouldn't be around. And now it looks like kind of a flip book because I've gone and scanned the result. So we have that to look at conceivably if there's questions about that. And I also did some work to cast the Common Lisp condition system into Python. And so I could talk a little bit about that. But those are really whole talks. And I'll only just kind of allude to them. But I just thought, in case nothing I said is provocative of questions, that maybe something in there would be. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to stop there.
Okay, great. I think we're gonna. I wanted a last call for people on YouTube. If you have a question, start posting them on the chat. I'll ask them. You got a ton of claps here. For me personally, this was everything I wanted to have for Lispmas.
Oh, good.
The Lispmas stories of old, Lispmas stories of new. I want to continue talking about that. The questions have been great. Let's see if we can get through some comments.
Oh, maybe I can get out of screen share mode, and then I can be back in a mode where I can see you guys. Let me try that. So if I stop that there. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, before I do, while I get my bearings, if anyone has a question they'd like to jump in, go for it.
I had questions about dev system and ASDF.
Okay.
So you famously wrote an article, I don't remember when, is it 80s or early 90s, about the idea of what later became ASDF, that is taking the dev system and making it object-oriented. And then you sat, and everyone sat on it for many years before ASDF was made. Why or why not? Or maybe everyone was satisfied with their own dev system. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, because when I was at MIT, one just wrote papers as a matter of course. It's like, oh, it's been a few days, I should write a paper or something like that. That was just a thing we did. And I got to say critically about the paper track that academia is so weird, because it had two tracks of papers, one called working papers and one called memos. And working papers were considered to be premature and not appropriate for reference in the literature. And memos were supposed to be more mature, and that's the kind of stuff you should do. But I don't know that you can know that kind of thing in advance. Like, I wrote a memo, which was that thing, and I was surprised, actually, that people got interested in it. I just wanted to kind of write down my thoughts, and I wasn't really proposing it for somebody to actually do it. There wasn't so much of a community back then in which it could really happen. Like the Lisp machine had a def system, and I was just saying kind of like, I like this model, and here's some thoughts I had. So that's why it kind of languished. Is I guess somebody just didn't pick that up for a while. On the other hand, I wrote a working paper about error systems, and that I think really was worthy of citation. And in fact, nobody really did that much, probably because it got published with a thing saying not worthy of citation or something. That's the way they do the working paper track. And so I went 5 years later, I took that paper and just kind of dusted it off. Basically, I went through it saying to myself, okay, I'm going to remove anything that doesn't look like an award-winning paper and make it be an award-winning paper, and republish the same thing in the EuroPal conference that year, won a Best Paper Award. But it was essentially the paper I'd written 5 years earlier, because, that was lost back then and nobody was really caring. So it's hard to put yourself back in those timeframes and analyze them. That's all I can say. History didn't always play out the way it looked like it did when you look back on it.
Okay.
And also the def system thing that I said that I need to publish is not either of those, and is a completely different system that will probably weird people out or maybe delight them, or both. But I'll do that on another occasion. I mention it mostly here so that people will remember to prod me on that, because it's just something that's been on my list for a couple of decades probably, and I haven't done anything about it.
Well, I'll tell you, you have an open invite if you ever want to do another presentation about that.
Yeah.
Definitely an open invite to take a look at it. I think we have a hand raised, Edith. You can unmute and ask your question or comment. He's on the conference. Oh, we got another one from whoever comes in first. Blake McBride.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, my question is, we have the Common Lisp, the language 1 and 2 out there, but we don't have one that has the ANSI standard. I know some guy did kind of a summary one, but something that's 1,000+ pages that has the full ANSI standard in it. I know that CL2 is similar, or close, but something that really has the whole thing.
The hyperspec is precisely that. The difference is that the standard, which you can get it from ANSI. They'll charge you a ton of money for it, though.
Yeah.
What happened was, the whole intellectual property story for that is very complex, and I didn't tell it for a long time because it requires saying it exactly right. And that's why the title of the paper, CL, The Untold Story. But it goes through in detail and tells you all the gory details of how the final negotiation of that worked. But it's important to understand that the first book, the Silver Book, was the product of a committee's effort over about 4 years, producing something that was not a standard because there was no associated standards body, but it was a committee effort, and it was a group thing. And Steele was the author, but it was really committee work. The CLTL2, which he says, and you can look at, you want to look at the preface matter, the stuff that's like, it's in Roman numerals. I think it's something like XVII or something is the page number that you want to look at. But he himself says this was just his own personal work. He did not coordinate that with the standards people. Like he took a snapshot of where we were, turned it into a book, and sold it because he perceived that there was a need for people to have some interim thing. And it turned out to have strategic value, which is explained in the Untold Story thing. So there was even that. But that's not the standard. So that's just a branch of something. We didn't vote on any of the things that were there. We had voted on things, but it was all interim, and it wasn't like the real votes and stuff. So, but the hyperspec was something that I took the actual sources for the tech document that ANSI sells. And with ANSI's permission, I had a letter from them saying permission because I told the story of how I got that, which was weird, but a little scary, but fun. Getting them to agree that they had to give me permission to do that. The hyperspec uses the exact sources, and that is the complete standard that you would get in the other thing. The typography is different, obviously, because it's not tech. And there are, somebody has out there there's a draft proposed standard which is different only in the front matter material. So the difference is you can get that and you can run it through tech and you can make it yourself and you don't have to pay anybody anything for it. And that will make you something that differs only in like what the headers are. It'll say this is a draft proposed standard as opposed to the other thing. But the actual material text of all the stuff that you would rely on to write a program is identical. And so I would recommend using that. But we got a little better at how to do that stuff when we did the ISO standard because I just put everything in the public domain before I even involved ISO with it. And I said, here, we put it in the public domain. You can use it too. But then they couldn't stop me from using it anywhere else. But the way we did it in the other situation was a little more complex. And I apologize for the messiness. It was kind of a learning experience, and it would take too long to go into a huge amount more detail. But you should read that paper, and then if you have more questions, then we could talk in some other form.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, and by the way, as far as papers, if you look at the description of the talk on YouTube, it's on YouTube as well. I have a link that goes through all his papers. He has it published somewhere with every paper that he has, including some of the history he went over tonight. So you can also read it firsthand as well.
And I have to say about that, this is a good chance to say it, that a lot of this stuff is not my story necessarily to tell. Like, I feel like a lot of stuff gets attributed to me because I'm a sort of natural storyteller.
Yeah.
I get credited for a lot of stuff that was really committee activities. First of all, it's really important to say that. So you should go read the credits and see like how many people were involved in this. And I did not do all this myself. But there's also lots of things that I did that nobody credits me for. So I kind of like figure it's like some sort of cosmic balance or something like that, maybe it sort of like works out. But for a long time, I just didn't say anything about these things, thinking other people would tell the stories. And then they just didn't. And so finally, I do it now, but with the knowledge that, sometimes it gets billed as my story, and that's only sort of true. I just deal with the pain.
Well, yeah, and you were part of the story, and actually, and this this is why I'm so happy to have this talk right now. It's because I do think it's very important, and one of the things that we should be proud of in the Lisp community is the long heritage that we have. And were clearly, and the Common Lisp Committee was very influential in that. It's still, it's very rare that you write something and it's still you that. I can't really say that for all of my programs. Most people's programs end up being in the legacy code. Right. Well, Common Lisp is still alive and active. But anyways.
MacLisp is still alive and active too, by the way. There's an emulator for the PDP-10. And I get questions about MacLisp code that implements Maxima on the PDP-10 still. So it's funny what goes away and what doesn't. It's interesting.
So I have another question from Ram. He put this much earlier, but I'm going to just go through some of the chats now. But given what you learned about your experience over the years, do you think Lisp as a language is still a viable alternative to perform system programming tasks, designing OSs, compilers, web servers, etc.?
Well, I think it can be used for that. I mean, this is kind of a personal choice thing. If you're asking me, like, you're about to do these things, and is that the language of choice to do it? I'm not sure that that's the right way to come to Lisp. If you're in there programming in Lisp and you're saying, could I try it? You can try it. I mean, like, one of the revelations that I had, like, when around the turn of the millennium, I was working for a small startup, and I had I had a layoff to do, and I didn't want to do that. I laid myself off instead, and I decided I would stay home and write some Lisp stuff. I thought that would be cool, and then I thought I need a web server, and there's no web server, so I decided, okay, I'll write a web server. So I spent about 6 months doing that, and then just as I was like getting to a place where it was almost done, Franz came out with theirs, and I thought, like, oh, my value proposition went from I have a web server to, isn't my syntax for making a web server cooler than theirs or something? And I felt like nobody's going to pay me any money for that. So that was an expensive lesson in understanding value propositions and how pricing occurs in the world. But you know, it was the thing that would have struck me soon enough after that anyway, was that Apache had really understood that the problem wasn't how do you do a web server, because they did one, and they did it in whatever language they like, probably C. But it's getting people to believe that you should be allowed to run as root on their machine. And so by whatever mechanism, I mean, it's hard to get people to trust you to do that. And you do not want to be doing a missionary sale of something that's already written in Lisp, and who knows what that is, at the same time as you're trying to like get people to trust you to be in that thing. You should have just been a module on, like, I should have just made a module for plugging into Apache. That's what would have been the right thing in that circumstance. So figuring out like where you are in the ecosystem, and is that really the thing you want to do? Like, can you do Lisp machine? I mean, we did Lisp machines, and they did that kind of stuff. The ability to build that hasn't gone away, but there's a lot of business involved in doing that, and other people are doing that quite well in other things. And just why would you spend your lifetime competing with something that's done well already by someone else? So that's really what the way I would break down that thing. I would just say, like, you know, do something that's important. And if you're just being a hobbyist, then don't care. Just do what you want. Like, there's sort of, it kind of bifurcates those two ways. But it's not an issue of can I. It's just an issue. The should I question is quite different, I think.
Okay. And by the way, Edith, if you want to interrupt and ask your question, I don't know if maybe you just hit the hands up by accident. Is there someone else hands up right now? Richard.
Yes, I have a hand.
Yes. Go for it.
Hi, Kent. First things first, thank you so much for this talk, and also loads of other things that you've written and published over the years. I've spent an exorbitant amount of time in my life reading the hyperspec and the draft standard and so forth. And I wonder, and also the formerly missing, now present again, I think, on Larry's GitHub, discussions of the cleanup committee that led to a lot of the hyperspec issues, X3J13 issues. I wonder if you have anything thoughtful, off the cuff, et cetera, to say about the utility of ambiguity in getting people to agree with things. Because it seemed to me that a decent number, I partially disagree with Larry on the implementation dependent comment that he made earlier in the standard, because that at least is explicitly vague. It seems like a decent number of issues resulted in agreeing to be implicitly ambiguous in the Common Lisp standard. And, you know, when I was younger, I thought that's annoying. And now I'm less young and I think, oh, that's very clever as a way to get people to agree. And I wonder if you had anything to say about it.
Well, I also sat on the scheme design committee up to R5RS, and I tried to get them to make agreements on like what happens in portability of like comparison operators, or, you know, it's like some really, really basic kinds of stuff, like numerical comparison I'm talking about. And, you know, that stuff was, or what kinds of errors get thrown in certain situations, and like, do you do trapping or not trapping? And at that time, for them, it was an issue of they wanted to just be in textbooks and they wanted to have that kind of portability as opposed to program portability. So I think I might have lost. Sorry, I get sidetracked on some of these things, and I might have lost track of the thread of the question that you're asking here.
Well, I just wondered if you had any reflections on getting people to agree by getting people to agree to something that means something different to every person who reads it.
Okay, yeah. So in the standard, it's true that we did opt for a lot of explicitly vague things as a way of reaching some sort of conclusion, just to call out the fact that there was a portability issue, so that people would not get snagged by it. I think. I mean, I submitted a paper which never got accepted anywhere, and I was kind of miffed about it because I felt like they didn't really understand it. Where I was talking, I probably should have tried it shopped at some other place or something, where I was talking about portability being a directional thing, and that things were inward portable or outward portable, and that implementations are either good for debugging stuff or good for receiving stuff, because you need to be permissive to receive stuff, but you need to be very sort of harsh if you're going to be distributing to a variety of different things. And it was a complicated space that I think that communities have to be in sync with that. It's not a thing you can just do in the language. Is that the community has to be willing to take it. I think HTML went through a similar kind of thing, because they really wanted to throw errors for various kinds of syntax problems, but that like people had written too many pages that were going to error, and that they just couldn't have that, and so they had to be like really tolerant. And so the question of how to manage like error checking in a world that just was not like willing to accept that things were allowed to error or something. It's a very sophisticated concept where you have to all be in sync. And so it's just, I mean, I just think it's complex. And, we did, as you say, I think correctly summarized it. We summarized some of that stuff just by saying explicitly vague, and the ambiguity. Also, ambiguity is a thing that's just a property of language, since we're talking about things that extend life lessons and stuff like that. I mean, like, you could not write a contract with somebody. You could not talk to somebody if you insisted on a certain meaning of a word with no stretch. I think of all words as having stretch. And this gets into the issue of the namespacing too. Like, there's a notion of simplicity that you see in the scheme community with the single namespace of saying every word should have exactly one meaning, and I should understand exactly what it means, do it, and I should have formal semantics and so on and so forth. Well, maybe. There's a notion of simplicity that it is, I have a very small formal semantics without a lot of detail and so on. But I think that small semantics lead to big sentences because, and to a lot of complexity elsewhere in terms of how you compose things. You get less complexity when you have a complex language that's full of nuance, but you only learn that language once, even if you use it many times. And so some people focus on how long it takes to learn a language, but it's really more interesting how long it takes to write a program in the language once you know it. So this is a many-dimensional space, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that, so there's the issues of learnability are different than the issues of how you manage errors. And there's a lot of different ways you can do things. But again, one last little detail on the issue of namespacing. The scheme way of doing things, which I respect but disagree with, is insensitive to the fact that, I mean, they claim that things are easier to understand if there's only one meaning, but there's not a single human dictionary that you can open where, for any language other than contrived languages like maybe Loglan or something like that, where or Esperanto maybe, I don't know, where there's only one definition for a word. Every normally accreting language on the planet, if you look at the number of definitions of words, it's many per word. and you have to pragmatically resolve all of those things. So the question of what simplicity is, I have an alternate notion of simplicity that says that it's not always the smallest thing. Sometimes it's a thing with an isomorphism to how the human brain conceives things. And our human wetware is full of parallelism and weird special cases and stuff like that. And we've devised languages that well suit that. So it's something to think about when you get into the simplicity arguments.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay. I'm just going to read some random comments that happened that I thought were really cool in the chat that I want to get on the live stream. Larry mentioned this was early on. I don't know what the context was, but I think we were talking about symbolics machines on the chat. And Larry mentioned the Xerox 1100 was launched in April 1981. Also, Ray Puzio had a question or a comment about when we were talking about when someone asked a question about this, like the C machine code, and he said, "My favorite quip on this topic is that C is assembler macros that made a programming language, and Lisp is a compiler macro made into a language." What do you think about that? I don't know. I think Ray might have left, so I don't know if he's here. So
well, the thing that comes to mind is not an answer to that, but it's just a memory that's triggered that.
Go for it.
Maybe we'll answer this another way. But I was out visiting the West Coast one day, and I had access to an InterLisp manual, which was an unusual thing. This was back in the day, and I thought, well, I'll read it. They're big, by the way. They're like 2 or 3 inches thick. But one of the things that informed my belief that Common Lisp was the right thing and that the East Coast language the right thing is the InterLisp was I think of as a very user-focused dialect, and that it had a lot of powerful features, but that it wasn't structured in a way that was as compositional, I felt. And the biggest thing that I thought I noticed on that was that it had a notion of macros, but they were called compiler macros, and they would rewrite code to change macros one form to another form. And then there was a note in some place in there that said that DWIM, which was Do What I Mean, Lauren Titleman's thing that would like correct your programs when you made mistakes and stuff, one of the user features, was willing to rewrite compiler macros in the interpreter in order to make sure that the interpreter and the compiler did something similar. But it was like that was an afterthought or something. It wasn't really part of having the same semantics. And that was very like the way MacLisp worked and not like the way Common Lisp worked. MacLisp was full of just ad hoc things like that. But Common Lisp really, I thought, had a better design because there was a sense that the semantics of the language would be sort of independent of whether you did a compilation or interpretation and so on. And there would be more uniformity. So you wouldn't have like something that was a compiler only feature, an interpreter only feature or something, but rather things that tried to just be expressive. So that's the thing that is triggered by that. I don't think that was really a response to the question. I don't know if that's
it's okay.
It's
a response
that I like to make. And I'm watching Larry's face to see how he's reacting to this. So I'm saying stuff and I'm not quite getting it. So I'm waiting for him to respond in particular.
And now you can have both. I've been working for the last few years on reviving InterLisp.
Yeah.
Not because it's going to be a competitive Lisp dialect, but as a way of understanding what was going on. Because in Bentley, you have both InterLisp and Common Lisp. InterLisp is in the IL : package. And there's IL : lambda versus CL : lambda. And IL : eval versus CL : eval. And all the data structures are the same.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to extend some of the data structures and one to adopt the other, but it's all kind of one system. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Actually, on the symbolics Lisp machine, little known fact is that I mostly did not do a lot of the system programming there, but one of the things that I did that was system programming was I did a weird thing with the implementation of what are called syntaxes in there, where it drives off of the read table that you've got active at a certain point, and it chooses which dialect of the language based on your choice of read table, because it thinks that the read table was generated by something in the language. It's kind of an obscure thing that you'd have to think hard about why that would be the right thing. But it allowed me to have 7 different co-resident dialects of Lisp in the same address space, so that like find package actually does different things depending on whose find package you're using, and so on. And it sounds like the same kind of thing that you're talking about, where people mostly never noticed that they were in the same address space using the same thing and that a partition was maintained. They didn't really know where exactly that was happening, but somehow it seemed to be mostly keeping firewalled. And that's the mechanism. Yeah.
And I'll just make a meta comment. Larry did give a talk with us, I think 2 or 3 years ago, about InterLisp, and you guys can check that on the YouTube channel. And there's a link to, I think, from it into the into there if you're interested in helping out with that project. Actually, I saw a article very recently that was put on Hacker News about InterLisp, about the renaissance going on. I think there's a guy who wrote a book. I actually got a copy of the book. He had a speech about it. So that was a nice thing. So yeah, definitely check that out.
You can run InterLisp by going to online.interlist.org, and you run on our server using ENC. We give you a whole account and store files.
So just to continue on with some of the comments, Ezekiel mentioned in respect to standard committees, one of the worst things that can happen is the scenario when you have people negotiating features, especially when they are large conglomerates like Microsoft. I'll vote for yours if you vote for mine. So I think this is the idea of like quid pro quo in standards. Do you know anything about that?
I can say that that's not allowed.
Okay.
I mean, that's pretty much the end of that. And we tried our best to, I mean, like, obviously, there's a slight variation of that is not only allowed but encouraged, which is that you want to make your proposal palatable. So, of course, you try to get things where you're trading stuff, but you're not trading because it's Microsoft or something like that. And that wasn't the vendor back then. But, like, it would have been, like, Symbolics or... what are the Texas Instruments had a Lisp machine, and Lisp Machines Incorporated, and there were, and Lucid and Franz, and there were a lot of companies. But like Gold Hill, for example, was selling on microcomputers, and they were little small operation, and they were right in there saying like, this isn't going to work for us. It doesn't, like, we can't get stuff to work. They were responsible for why the error system is not built on the class system. They wanted the ability to have errors without offering the class system under some set of circumstances or something. So the meta class of error, I believe, is unspecified, if I recall correctly. It's been a long time since I looked at these things. So I might be making an error. Do not rely on anything that I say about the actual truth.
You might be making an error about the error handler?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. And I have to say, by the way, this would go in my other talk, but it bears repeating. I am responsible for what, so I did a prototype of the error system, and I distributed it to a bunch of different companies, and they started using it. And it appeared in some of their marketing literature. Somebody, I can't remember which company, said, we have Pitman errors. And I have to say, if I go back to do it again, I'm not doing the error system. Like Gabriel got to be the benchmark guy, and I get to be the error guy. So that part was, I mean, it was nice that they just thought people would know who I was, I guess. But on the other hand, there's probably flashier things I could have been known for. So yeah.
I have a question. You brought up McCarthy, right? John McCarthy, and I would love to get some, maybe you could bring some stories for us young Lispers that never had experience to, talk to the father of Lisp. You have any
Boy.
interesting John McCarthy stories? And anyone else on the chat if they have? Looking at you, Larry. But
Yeah,
But if
Yeah, I
there's
think
anyone
that
else here,
Larry's more likely to have somebody. I wish Dick Gabriel were here because he
Yeah.
would probably have stories. I mean, the only interaction I remember with him was that when we were doing the early design, I think this was him. We were doing the early sort of working out kind of what our charter was, and it might have been actually working out the actual charter text. And somebody had said, what one of the pieces of text in the charter, let me go and look at it, was that we would establish normative Common Lisp programming practice. And so the question was, what does that mean? And some of it was like about the question of like the append function and whether or not that was just a trap to get people to write n-squared functions. And so there was like some business about the issue of, current use or something like that. But really, most of my interactions with McCarthy were pretty cursory because he was just occasionally involving himself when there was something that went wrong. I had a lot of leeway as to how to present stuff in the standard, and I made a change where I described a difference between Booleans and generalized Booleans. And generalized Booleans are ones that are true, but they aren't T or F. And that really upset Boyer and Moore of Boyer and Moore Theorem Prover fame, because they were doing something where they were comparing the truth value of various kinds of things, and they just wanted them to be EQ or something, and they couldn't be. And I think McCarthy got involved in that discussion as well. But the truth was, I didn't change the semantics at all. All I did was correctly describe what happened and show up a bug possibly in what they were doing by, again, sort of like what we were talking about before with the, just making some of the truth of things a little more obvious. So, but yeah, I don't know. Larry, do you have any comments on McCarthy?
McCarthy, I took a course from him. It was impossible to understand, and he wrote very small script on the board. I met John McCarthy at a party where the punch bowl was spiked. And I remember listening to him talk about two ideas he had. One was, this was in like 1971 or 2. What if the U.S. gave for the millennium, gave a birthday party and invited everyone in the world to come to the U.S. for a party? And how you would do that, and how many people you would need, and he read it's all worked out. And then the other thing that he was talking about was, what if there was an infinite number of characters rather than a finite number of characters, and every image could have its own character code? And he was kind of wandering around that point of view. And I think I remember asking him about Common Lisp later on, and then he talked about this. He called it log rolling, saying that it may not be explicit, but I had my feature and you had yours, and we both try and roll the logs and accumulate features that way.
Yeah.
Okay, I actually have another comment from YouTube, from MePlan. Thank you very much. I think it was when we were talking about symbolics in the X11, Xerox 1100. It says, was LMI an important player in the Common Lisp standardization? I'm not familiar with LMI. Maybe you can.
That's Lisp Machines Incorporated.
Oh, Lisp Machines Incorporated. Okay, thank you.
Greenblatt was a participant.
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody was.
Yeah. We didn't call people by what company they came from.
It was, yeah, all the companies were all represented, but also people just spoke as individuals. And this was a thing I had meant to mention in the talk. I just didn't have a slide for it. But the whole issue of agency is an interesting one. It's in legal agency, like who are you an agent for or something like that. Partly it goes to the question of understanding people. Like if I were fired from one company and hired by another, would I behave differently? Probably I would. So, some of that is that. But some of these people also had individual personalities that they were carrying with them as well. And sometimes it was hard to keep them straight because at one of the ISO meetings, the international things, and I was representing the United States at that time, but I was also under really complicated rules for when I could speak for the United States. And so very careful mostly not to. And I used to laugh at the Japanese would say, this is just yet another thing that I had to kind of have an evolution of understanding about. But, what they would often, when they were speaking, say something like, this will be my personal opinion. And then they would say something, and then they would say, this has been my personal opinion. And it seemed Baroque and like something like unnecessarily complex. But one day I had been talking to some people, and I later heard myself quoted as saying, the United States said this. And I was like, the United States did not say that. Yeah. I said that. I'll tell you when the United States says that. So the whole business of when you're speaking for whom is really quite complicated. Mm-hmm. Many of you may have run into this if you're just even representing your own company going out somewhere. So you have to be very careful about when you're speaking in social media for yourself or something else. And I often represent myself as being from Hypermeta, which is my personal S Corp that I use for consulting. Even when I'm employed by somewhere else. I was working at Harvard until last month, but I knew I would be leaving. So that's why I listed myself for Hypermeta here, as I wasn't. I'm not even working for Harvard right now, but it is a complicated thing, and people did not want to feel like technical opinions were coming from companies. We tried really hard to go by the technical merit of things and the impact on users and the impact on implementers. Those things really mattered a lot.
I left the Lisp community in the early 90s and started working on other stuff and the web. So I wound up chairing the HTTP working group and the URI working group in the IETF, and then later on in W3C on the advisory board in the technical architecture group. But working on Lisp was my entree into that world. If I could get Moon and Fallman to agree to something, maybe I could get Netscape and Digital to agree to something.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of merit to that.
Right. The IETF had rules. The W3C had different rules. W3C was a member organization, and the decisions got made by the advisory committee, which consisted of one person from each company that was a member. While IETF says you have to identify what your affiliation is, that no one speaks for a company. You're giving your own technical opinion, and opinion decisions are made by rough consensus. There is no voting. And, and some differences between the two. But in the end, W3C kind of caved with their invited expert forum that anyone who wanted to participate could be an invited expert, unless they were with a company that could be a member, and then they should get their company to join.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I also have some other comments here from earlier. Francois Rideau said ASDF now has a package inferred system feature that also does the package as a module thing. I guess you mentioned something about that earlier. ASDF is the, by the way, for people that don't know, is the it's pretty much the de facto standard of sending libraries throughout the Common Lisp community. And Francois was actually one of the major maintainers of it for a very long time. Says Also, I may have questions about the deaf system OO proposal that inspired yeah. And then also he said, he mentioning continuations, I think Paul asked about continuations earlier. Said for continuations, I'm told that Steve Russell had to invent them in practice for some Lisp users. As for the theory, SECD machine had a J separator between the two. So that's a good answer for Paul out there. I think that's, let's see if I got all the questions.
Yeah, and we could cut away from the YouTube at some point. And
yeah. I'm pretty much I'm pretty much going to end it now. I just wanted to get some of that out there for posterity. Just give me a moment here. Just gonna want to talk to the audience. Moderator. Okay. Yeah, I want to first of all, I want to thank you, Kent, for coming tonight and giving us this fantastic speech. It's been absolutely really great. I just love learning about, you know, we're always in the daily grind of programming, and it's nice to know the stories behind the types of technology that we're using today. So I'm really grateful for that. Also, I want to, this is the end of the year, I want to also thank my co-organizers, Jeff Parker and Zoe Breiterman, who, you know, it's hard to do stuff alone, so it's great having a team. Jeff's been tremendously, has contributed so much over the years, and Zoe's been just like the brightest spot in the last few since she joined. So thank you guys so much. I also want to thank, we stand on the social, we all stand on the on the shoulders of giants. So I want to thank the previous organizers, because for people that don't know, Lisp NYC is over 20 years old. So Pierre Delacaze, who I'm still keeping the seat warm. I want him back. Thank you for everything you've done. And Hugh Goodman, who was my very first organizer when I first came into Lisp NYC back in the early aughts. Thank you guys so much for that. And of course, I want to thank our previous speakers, Kai, going backwards, Kai, Dimitri, and John. Thank you guys for the speaks. Thank you guys again for the speeches. And I want to thank the audience here who, thank God we have such a very smart audience with all these amazing questions, because I think it really enhances both on the conference and on the
Are you all right?
on,
You look
on
tired.
YouTube. Yeah, so anyways, Merry Listmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.
Yep.